I will now give the floor to our second distinguished introducer, Mr. Nadim Houry, who is a Human Rights Watch Director of Terrorism and Counterterrorism Program. Prior to joining Human Rights Watch, he served as Deputy Counsel for the Volcker Commission, where he spent more than a year conducting fact-finding missions in the Middle East as part of the United Nations Corruption Inquiry into the Oil for Food program. An attorney by training, Nadim is fluent in Arabic and French. Mr. Houry, the floor is yours.
Good morning. Thank you very much. How do you defeat terrorism? Salman Rushdie was once asked. His answer was simple: don't be terrorized. Now, why start a presentation about protection of human rights with a literary citation? Because the issue of how to protect human rights while fighting terrorism today is not simply about a few measures that need to be discussed or tweaked, but rather it is the whole approach, the structure of how states are pursuing counterterrorism that needs to be discussed. Traditionally, liberal democratic states largely relied on their criminal justice system to deal with terrorist threats. Of course, you had exceptions and abuses, but generally the accepted framework was a criminal law enforcement one. Planners and perpetrators of terrorist acts were treated as criminals, maybe heinous criminals, but criminals nonetheless, and were dealt with through the judicial system. Now, a criminal justice response that is based on the principles of rule of law and human rights is arguably the most accountable and legitimate response to terrorism. It helps avoid an escalation of violence and ensures that any state-sanctioned response is very much placed at the heart of the rule of law framework. And frankly, it worked well overall with many terrorist groups, be it of the anarchist, fascist, extreme left, nationalist, or religious kind of the last century. Now, this model has been under attack. First, after 9/11, and in the last few years in response to ISIS. After the terrible attacks of 9/11, the US decided to move away from a criminal justice response and its underpinning assumptions. It threw out the rule book and decided to wage what George W. Bush called at the time the global war on terror. Now, Bush did not just put aside international law, but also domestic checks and balances by trying to circumvent US courts. This shift in approach had disastrous effects and led to abuses in Guantanamo, Abu Ghraib, illegal rendition flights, torture memos, military commissions, and special registration procedures in the US for foreigners from certain countries. While some OSCE countries joined this disastrous global war on terror, many others provided a useful counterbalance by refusing to embrace the paradigm and insisting on due process and law enforcement tools. But now the emergence of ISIS over the last few years, the increase in terrorist attacks on European soil, and successive populist attacks on judicial institutions and liberal politics have caused cracks in this model. And an increasing number of states, including many OSCE members, are embracing a response that I would argue undermines the rule of law and human rights. So what are some of the new and troubling trends in counterterrorism efforts? I want to focus on 5 key aspects that, taken together, show a drift away from this law enforcement approach and a weakening of the rule of law. They're not exhaustive, but I believe these are some of the key general trends. First, the banalization of states of emergency. Over the last 2 years, countries as diverse as France, Egypt, Ethiopia, Tunisia, and Turkey have cited terrorism as a reason to enact or extend states of emergency. Some of these emergency measures vastly increase government powers to search, detain, and monitor individuals, to shut establishments such as meeting houses and places of worship, and to ban public gatherings or free speech. Other countries like Hungary have adopted constitutional amendments or new legislation to make it easier to declare a state of emergency. And even others have introduced now exceptional powers, usually found in emergency laws, into permanent law, such as the 2000 16 counterterrorism law here in Poland, or the draft counterterrorism law currently being discussed and probably will be adopted by the end of this month in the French Parliament. Declaring a state of emergency has its place, of course, and international law allows it. But the issue is that these measures are supposed to be exceptional. And today, what we are increasingly hearing is governments saying that a state of emergency is needed as long as there is a high security risk. Now, given that no one knows when the risk will be deemed acceptable in this current day and age, and most politicians, and I can understand why, prefer to err on the side of caution, and to this day I have yet to hear a politician tell its audience, oh, the risk has gone down, it's all safe. The exceptional becomes the new normal. By suggesting that regular laws, procedures, and oversight mechanisms are not sufficient to counter threats and to keep our societies safe, it weakens the premise of the rule of law and relegates it to what I would consider a luxury for quote-unquote normal times, which we don't know when we will return to. And that is a danger for the rule of law when it becomes something exceptional. Secondly, the overly broad and vague definitions of terrorism. Now, the debate about what constitutes terrorism is very, very old, and I have no desire to revisit it today. But the key issue here is that increasingly, countries from Australia, Brazil, Canada, China, Egypt, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Tunisia have been enacting counterterrorism laws or have enacted counterterrorism laws in the last few years, criminalizing non-violent activities that fall far short of what usually is considered material support or participation in terrorist groups. We have documented the use of counterterrorism laws to prosecute and prolong incarceration of political activists, human rights defenders, students, journalists, and trade unionists. Many countries have used broad definitions of terrorism to silence dissenting voices or pressure them. Just in the last few weeks, Turkey has detained and investigated a French journalist, Louis Bureau, for terrorism because he had photos of himself standing with Kurdish fighters in Syria. And this is also happening in countries with traditionally strong rule of law measures. And a clear example was when the UK stopped David Miranda at Heathrow Airport and questioned him under Schedule 7 of its Terrorism Act, not because of terrorism, but because he possessed documents provided by Snowden. The principle of legality under international law requires that criminal laws are sufficiently precise that it is clear what constitutes a criminal offense. The third trend is the criminalization of various forms of expression that fall short of incitement to violence. We've seen a trend of countries criminalizing any expression that is deemed to praise, glorify, apologize for acts defined as terrorism. But what constitutes glorifying terrorism or apology of terrorism? That's a real question, and we have seen courts struggle with it and often silence legitimate forms of expression. And this has affected many people, from activists to children and teenagers saying things on Facebook or in their school courtyard. Now, some of these things are nasty, and I would not want to hear it from my children, but should it be basis for people, for young people to go to jail? In Spain, for example, glorification of terrorism has caught up with artists. And in February 2016, two puppeteers were charged with glorifying terrorism for staging a show that included violent scenes and a puppet holding a sign that referenced Al-Qaeda and ETA, the Basque group. A judge eventually dismissed the charges 4 months later, but meanwhile the puppeteers had been jailed for 4 days and barred from leaving the country. In France, in the wake of the Charlie Hebdo attacks, France has been applying its glorification of terrorism penal code provision very broadly, convicting hundreds of people, including dozens of children, some as young as 13 for referencing ISIS in social media or during altercations with the police. When it comes to criminalizing expression, international law requires strict conditions to ensure that such sanctions do not restrict freedom of expression. The fourth trend is the use of administrative control measures to restrict people's freedom of movement. Increasingly, states are resorting to administrative control measures to control movement. These measures include house arrest or assigned residency, confiscation of travel documents, and regular reporting procedures to police and other places. Now, what is the human rights issue with these measures? People are punished before any crime has been committed. And secondly, there are usually no safeguards or recourse for those affected to properly challenge these measures. Now, let me just be very clear. States don't have to wait for an attack to take measures. And criminal law already penalizes a whole set of preparatory acts and could be used and has been used for the last century to prosecute suspected terrorists or those planning terrorist acts way before they commit an attack. The problem is with this shift to administrative measures is that people are being punished without a real proceeding, without the ability to defend themselves, and usually on the basis of evidence that they don't have full access to. The central figure of the judicial judge deciding who should go to jail is slowly being replaced by an administrative judge, and so far, examining these procedures have shown that these administrative judges, in most cases, are more reluctant to stand up or question executive power. And finally, the last trend, mass surveillance. States have been expanding their mass surveillance practices. Now, there's obviously a legitimate goal to surveil security threats, but any communication surveillance must be necessary and proportionate. Indiscriminate mass surveillance and retention of people's communication for potential future use runs against this. Now, this can quickly get very, very technical, and I'm not going to get into the technicalities, but I want to bring it back to a basic example. How would you feel if the state went into your house while you were away at the office or at this conference just to check that you were not doing anything criminal? They go in, they see what you have in your apartment, they open your mailbox, everything back in its place, and they leave. Now, I'm sure you would all be very upset, and you would feel that your privacy has been violated. Well, why should we accept it then when it happens online, especially since increasingly a large part of our life is online? Our love letters are online, our private communication, our financial situation. Just because technology allows it does not make it okay to have mass surveillance. Let me just quickly conclude. The issue is not the pursuit of security by states or opposing security and freedoms. The terrorism threat is real, and the state is expected to respond to it. Rather, the issue today is the rush to adopt ever more restrictive measures without a proper assessment of their impact on key freedoms, freedoms that have taken decades to be earned, and rights. And also without a real examination of their effectiveness. An inflation of legislative activity. With every new attack, we're seeing new laws before law enforcement has even had time to absorb the previous law. Incrementally but surely, these measures are weakening judicial oversight, blurring lines between war and law enforcement, and eroding key protections. The impact of these measures is felt most acutely by members of certain ethnic or religious groups, notably Muslims, migrants, and refugees. And this treatment is further eroding their trust in the national authorities. It is essential to stop this drift towards more repressive measures and create the space for a calm, evidence-based discussion on the appropriate response to new security threats. The temptation to adopt new laws and measures after every attack when emotions are at their height should be resisted. States should return to a criminal justice response to terrorism and provide their judicial authorities with the resources to confront these new challenges. This is not naive. The judicial system has shown itself capable in the past of adapting to ever-changing and increasingly international forms of terrorism through better international cooperation and more resources. And many countries have shown that it is possible. But in order to have the space for discussion on how to confront terrorism, it is essential to address the climate of fear. The late US President Franklin D. Roosevelt famously said during his first inaugural address, which coincided with the Great Depression, a much more terrifying time than today, that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Thank you very much.